Now we're going to talk about why we burn. And this goes back to how we kind of introduced this objectives-based burning. Burning for the sake of burning is almost never a good idea, right? Too much work, too much risk. You know, it's like, why do it if we're not going to obtain something greater? And there are many, many, many greater things to obtain. And I want to preface this whole thing with, many of us have livestock, right? And you will hear that, I don't need to burn because I can accomplish that with grazing, right? You don't often hear, I don't need to graze because I can accomplish that with burning. But that does happen, and that's kind of on the flip side. Agencies often take that approach. It's too hard to get cattle on the ground, and we don't have any fence, you know, there's too many logistics, the lawyer's getting away, so it's just easier for us to burn. In both cases, we're cutting ourselves short on the ecology of our grasslands. They do, in some ways, mimic each other, but they are not the same tool. And we're going to get into that here in a little bit. But why burn? Grassland rejuvenation. We've got exotic species throughout the state. Regardless of where you are, there's exotic species. There's cool season grasses. There's exotic forbs. Some of those obviously are noxious. Fire can help with a great many of our exotic species. And people ask me a lot of times, they're like, well, how does that make sense? How does, if it hurts an exotic species, why doesn't it hurt a native species? And the best answer that I can give in a nutshell is our native species in this part of the world evolved with fire and grazing, okay? Human occupation of what we might call the Mediterranean area or the European region, much longer human occupation, much longer human influence on those lands and on those species, and so a lot longer history of fire suppression. And I'm not going to go too far into this, but many of the species that are exotics here that we fight don't have much of a fire regime that they come from overseas. Does that generally make sense? The question was, what other parts of the world evolved with grazing and fire? Okay, so we know Africa has a lot of history of both grazing and fire. The Mediterranean, Eurasian region, a lot of steppe, what they call grassland steppe, but a lot heavier grazing history, which I think I can confidently say probably limited the fire history. Europe, much longer history of human influence, both as users of the land and as cultivators of the land. And so those species just don't seem to they seem to not respond well to fire like our native species do. And that's probably the best answer I can give without this becoming a whole lecture on world ecology. But suffice it to say that we rarely, I'm not saying we don't hurt native species, like a native ash tree or a native plum thicket or a native buffalo berry thicket, you might say. If that fire's timed when that is actively growing and putting on leaves, yeah, we're going to hurt it with fire. We're not going to kill it though, oftentimes. And we oftentimes don't kill even the exotic species that we're trying to control, but we can definitely suppress them and set them back. So it's a twofold thing. It's inappropriate to say that fire kills the exotics, right? But it's a two-prong approach. We're setting back the exotics, we're hurting them while we're stimulating the natives and giving our natives a competitive advantage. That's really what we're trying to do here. And likely because of that, it's funny, you have a history of fire as a career like I have, and almost all of my work historically is, I'll admit, kind of worthless. Because it's not so much the last fire that was lit that's important, it's the next one that you're going to do. Because the last one, if it was 10 years ago, the positive ecological effects wear off over time. So I may have to return. So it's a continual process, just like grazing management or anything else. You can't really be one and done with fire. Now in more mature plant communities, like what Sean's doing in the Missouri River breaks, where fire, well-timed fire, truly will kill that eastern red cedar, if it's done well, that is a long-term impact that is sustainable on the landscape. It doesn't mean that he won't have to return that fire sometime, but he may not have to come back next year. He may not have to come back for 15 years, 20 years if he's successful with the objectives of that fire. So litter removal is important. We use fire to prepare sites for reseeding, cleaning off litter. Those are just some examples. We'll use fire to basically stimulate or rejuvenate a plant community that becomes sparse. I'm just going to use that word for now. And you'll see that today when we go out on these burn units. Take some time to look down into the plant community. What we're going to be burning today hasn't had any real management, grazing or fire, for arguably decades. And you will see that the production is so bad. There's no other word to say it. It's just sparse. The brome plants, even though it's infested with brome and bluegrass, it's bluegrass mats, and the brome plants got a lot of space in between them. So even if you were just saying, well, I don't even want to burn here, I'm just going to utilize my brome, the production, I don't really know. I haven't had a chance to measure it, but it's not good. So this site needs fire. Could we accomplish some of what we're accomplishing with fire through grazing? Yeah, I do believe we could accomplish some of it. I think we could stimulate this place with some grazing, but it's not going to do the same thing that fire is going to do. It needs a shock to the system that, in my opinion, through experience, only fire can provide here. And so it's a good site to practice on. Soil health and just vigor of the plant community can be stimulated. What we're doing is taking a site that might look like this, we're making it look like this for a very short time period to gain this in the long run. Lush, healthy vegetation. Wildlife, livestock, all things benefit with returning natural processes to the landscape. These are general statements. Another thing, these are all very general. There's always an exception to every single thing I tell you today, bar none, has an exception somewhere along the line, all right? And we'll be talking about that with our instructors throughout. There's always the caveat, there's always the if or the and or the but generally speaking, fire stimulates our native plant communities, and that's one of our primary objectives. Wildlife, I already mentioned the birds, right? We burned up his wife's home. We didn't burn up his wife, right? They can re-nest. Now they need somewhere else to go to re-nest, and that's very important. We never really want to burn all of everything within a block. So if you take the Oak Lake Field Station here, the station's about 700 acres. We've got a large lake to the east, got a highway to the north that filters off into some pretty heavily grazed pastures and cropland. To the west is all cropland, and to the south is primarily cropland with a little bit of CRP. So it's kind of an ecological island. It would be ecologically not responsible if we burned the whole thing in one shot, because we have to think about our recolonizers, our insect community, our bird community. Where are they going to go if we don't provide at least some place for them to go to? So we talk about mosaics and patchiness. We want to never burn all of everything, but we also want to make sure that we got to balance that against safety and security for the fires themselves, okay? So for landowners, let's just use a CRP field, for example. If you don't have great security around your larger CRP field, and we'll talk about fire breaks here and stuff, you may not have the capacity to split that field very well. You may just not be able to handle it. And so there's some truth to burning. Sometimes bigger is easier because you can fall back to these, better fire breaks. So there's a balance between the ecological objectives of the fire and then the safety objectives of actually being able to get it done. And if you need to do a fire, there's no point in making that plan so complicated that you actually can't accomplish it. So we have to find that balance. Again, just diversity. So what does a fire do? Like if you compare it to grazing, is that if you're going to remove all your litter, you can achieve that with grazing. Your cows might starve, but you can do it. For the most, you can get a lot of it, right? But you can't do it all in one shot. With a fire, you can accomplish that litter removal within hours or maybe within minutes. Whereas with grazing, you may never get a complete removal and it takes time. And so there's a difference. You have a less disturbance time on the land and you can target certain species with fire. Whereas grazing, we know they're going to be selective. It's very hard right this time of year to graze snowberry or buckbrush. Everybody familiar with what buckbrush is or snowberry? We'll take a look at it out there. You're not going to graze your poison ivy off unless you've got, I don't even think goats will eat poison ivy, will they? I don't know. That's a good question. But you can't have a full impact on the entire plant community with grazing. Even if you graze down to the nubbins, they're still not going to eat prickly pear cactus unless they're in Texas where that's all they've got to eat. But so time and space and place matters. And so fire is kind of that great equalizer. It can reset the entire system. So what are we targeting? Well, we've got our grasses, we've got our cool season introduced grasses. Often in this part of the world, that's a short list, there's more, but brome and bluegrass. And if you don't know what these are, ask today. I've always make this grand assumption that people know what these grasses are, and I that's a failure on my part. I didn't even point that out very well yesterday. But this is kind of the target of what we're trying to control with our burns. In eastern South Dakota, our native cool season grasses largely are not negatively affected by fire. Seems kind of ironic, but they really do well. In fact, Canada wild rye, green needlegrass, and needle and thread in particular, I would say they're stimulated by spring fire in eastern South Dakota. Sandy was talking yesterday, when you get out west, there's some data that would show that possibly our needle grasses as a community might be hurt. But a lot of that also has to do with wildfire, follow-up of wildfire, which is not planned, so you can have detrimental effect. Generally what we're saying is that it's going to be beneficial, but as you go further west, there's a little more caveats to what I'm saying that may have to be taken into consideration. I think though, across the board, warm season grasses largely benefit from fire, even almost at any time of the growing season. Now, if you hit them right at boot stage, I have seen that they don't respond very well. And like in this area, if we were burning in mid to late July, we're probably going to hurt our big blue stem for that growing season. But for the most part, they're stimulated. This graph just kind of drives that home. Total biomass, and I'm not going to go into all of the background on where this study was conducted. Generally speaking, what I want to show is that unburned versus burn, total biomass burning increases production, increases total biomass production. When you look at our warm season grasses, it's really dramatic. We really have a large effect on our warm season grass community in eastern South Dakota with spring burning. And when we look at our native cool season grasses, even for the most part, we have a positive influence. We have higher production of even our cool season grasses, natives in this area with spring burning. So what are we managing for determines when we time that fire. Again, are we trying to stimulate the warm season or cool season grass community while knocking back or hurting our exotics? What's our main objective? And so, of course, timing is key, okay? Now, you may have a lot of questions about your own place. What is the right time to do that fire? I'm not going to take time to answer all those questions right now. But as we're out there today, pull an instructor aside, tell them your situation, take the opportunity to run those questions by an instructor and get some opinion on when you should or shouldn't burn on your own place. Generally, if we're trying to control our cool season grasses, our introduced grasses, if we're burning in April, we're a little early for exotic control unless you're further west where you're getting into cheat grasses and crested wheat and that type of thing. Summer burns, July through August. Of my opinion, there's not a whole lot to be accomplished in that timing. Sandy's got some plots out here though that we're going to find out a little bit more about that. So we've got a series of burn plots out here that we'll be burning mid-summer, mid-growing season, just to try to put some meat on that bone and see what positives and negatives are of that. And then as far as if we're really trying to stimulate our warm season grasses, that late spring burning, okay? When it comes to fall burning, I will share that I'm not a fan of fall burning. When I say fall, I'm talking really anywhere from the end of August on. The reason being is that we live now in a world of exotic species. If all of our species were just native species, I wouldn't care so much about fall burning as far as the plant ecology. But now when we burn in the fall, what's going on at that time of year is every exotic in the world is seeds are blowing in the wind. And so now you take that cover off your burn unit at that time of year, and you just open that site up for infestation from exotic species, blowing in the wind, if you will. The other thing is it takes off winter cover and exposes the soil possibly to wind erosion. Now, if it's a good native plant community, I'm not too concerned about the erosion because we rarely burn so deep that it really hits the soil structure. But we also are very habitat limited anymore. And so when we're talking about, this is as much about ecology as anything else, there's got to be a really strong objective to validate taking off all that cover and going into the winter season. So what might be one of those objectives that's valid if you're going to do that? Can anybody give me? Volunteer trees, excellent. Yeah, fall may be, you may find that window of a dry fall where you've got good grass production. The trees are starting to dry down a little bit early. You may be able to smack some brush or some cedar trees or something in that time period. And if that's your only opportunity, then yes, you're sacrificing something, but for the greater good of that control. So that could be a very valid reason. What's not a valid reason is this, and I think sometimes we maybe overteach on fire, is that all fire is good all the time. That's not really true. You're not going to accomplish anything for brome or bluegrass control at that time of the year. Even if the brome is green, which it can be in eastern South Dakota, we can have green brome in August. Oftentimes we don't, but we can. If it's cooler and we get wet, we're going to have green brome. I don't think I would target that. Sandy, I'd like your opinion on that, but I don't think that fire is going to really set that brome community back at all for the following growing season.
The only time you can maybe hurt it is when those perennial plants are putting down, the products of photosynthesis down into the roots. So we're talking about kind of carbohydrate storage, and so if you interrupt that storage, you can put a hurt on it. And so it would have to be putting it into a negative carbohydrate balance, which means somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks before you get that final freeze that ends the growing season. So the reason I bring that up is because this has been instilled in me with alfalfa management. And growing up in Wisconsin, they always said, do not cut your final cutting 4 weeks before you get a final freeze, because then it starts to regrow and then it draws down its carbohydrates. So if you put a burn in September, early or late September, you burn that stuff off, the brome is going to want to try to regrow again. Plants always try to reestablish the shoot at the expense of the root. Mm-hmm. So you could perhaps put it in a negative carbohydrate balance, but again, I think the negatives outweigh the benefits, because you can, again, if you're trying to hurt the cool seasons, do it in May.
Yeah.
And if you're eliminating pheasant habitat or opening up for wind erosion and not going to get the snow catch, those I think outweigh the benefit of trying to put in a negative carbohydrate balance. I'd rather put the negative carbohydrate balance in the spring and then allow the warm seasons to come. That's the other thing, is like the warm seasons they're already dormant. So
right.
So then what's how much follow time are you going to have for regrowth? And you don't get that with the spring. Now, if you're down in Oklahoma, you've still got another couple months left. So again, it is always this caveat of where are you? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we're giving you information about South Dakota, but if you're in Oklahoma or Texas, you're not gonna get that first freeze until late November, December, right? And so it's a whole different
game, yeah. So the first question about baling or haying your CRP. So plants, there's some just general truth. So when you take a plant off or cut a plant or graze a plant or burn a plant, as it's entering into boot stage, which is that stage as it's trying to just shoot its head out, that's when it's most vulnerable. Pretty much across the board, what you say. So when you're haying CRP, for instance, some of the CRP haying rules are also a little bit contradictory to good vegetation management, because if you've got to wait till the end of the nesting season, which in South Dakota is August.
You can hay after July 15th.
No, you can't.
Oh, they changed it then.
That's Fish and Wildlife rules, but for USDA rules, we're looking at August 1 or 15, well, August 1st, okay? So August 1st, if you're really wanting to, say, suppress your big blue stem, maybe you got CRP that's just so choked with big blue stem you want to suppress it. You want to actually hay that and hay it when it's at boot stage, because you're going to kind of set that plant back. However, if you're trying to hay it for the very best benefit of the plant community, it's better to wait till it goes dormant in late September, because then it's gone through its cycle, and you're haying. Now your quality is going to be worse of that hay crop, but you'll accomplish more on the ground. So what I want to reiterate again is we are teaching you today best management practices for ecology. How that does or does not mesh with rules we're not going to be able to solve that here. Okay, we can talk about it. We can ask the questions, but you're not going to walk out of here with an answer that's going to say, okay, now I can do this because I understand it. We want you to understand it, but it doesn't change the dilemma. Okay, all right. I guess that's my disclaimer. So I've already talked a lot about cool season and warm season plants, but generally what does that really mean is that our cool season plants are hitting their peak production right about now, all right? Warm season plants are a little bit delayed. They'll hit their peak production late June to early to mid-July, all right? And then our cool season plants will hit a peak production here again in the fall, which comes back to the conversation we just had. Or if I'm trying to hurt brome, which is a cool season plant, do I have an opportunity to put a little bit of hurt on it, not necessarily in August, but getting into September, October with a fire as it's trying to regrow for the fall? And I would say the answer is yes, I have an opportunity. But that opportunity is fairly narrow, and like we talked about, the chances of missing that and doing more negative than positive are probably outweigh. Okay, now, there is a slight caveat to this, and what they've found in North Dakota on some of their heavily infested range sites, native range, where they've got just a tremendous amount of Kentucky bluegrass, if this fire occurs and they have an open winter and they've got the lighter soils, the theory is that cold is penetrating into that soil. There's just no cover. You're getting a much deeper penetration of cold open winter, that it can really hurt that Kentucky bluegrass. But it still doesn't change the rest of the story. You still have a denuded landscape open all winter, no cover, no snow catch, nothing. And so yeah, you might have hurt that brome, but also come spring rains, are you going to capture the moisture, the snow melt, or did you capture the snow at all? And you may really hurt your production the next year, especially if you go into a drought year. This year would have been, had you burned in western South Dakota last fall with this objective, you might have really regretted it this spring.